So for today, what we'll talk about is the principles. I was going to talk about users and groups, but this one will be more catered towards principles. The two types of principles, we have service principles and you have user principles. Yep. So I'll share my screen real quick. All right. So over here, we have two types of principles, user principles and service principles. And these are, this is what you'll use to authenticate against your tenant. So over here, we have a user. And over here, we can say this is a service principle. All right. So one is used for automation and the other one is used to interact with the Azure portal. So whenever you create your tenant, the first account that's created, that's your company account, you can say. Now, or company administrator, that account is used to authenticate against a tenant, and that is your admin account. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So if you sign up for a free subscription or a tenant, you always need to have one account to log in.
Okay.
Yep. And I'll put this as a triangle itself. Supposed to be a diamond, yeah, which is your Azure Active Directory. Now, you would need to authenticate against Azure Active Directory, and thus you need an account. And when you want to create any automation, that's why you need to know which type of account you'll be using to do that automation. Will you use a user account, or will you be using an SPN or an automation account? Right? So you have a choice between using either user account or you have an SPN, which is a service account. So user accounts, if you take this on premises, it's the same thing. If you take your service principles on premises, it's your service accounts that are used on premises. These are usually used in scripts and automation, and these are also used in scripts, but they're mostly used by human beings with the username and password, so you can log in. Now, we have different types of user accounts. One type of user account would be a member, which belongs to the tenant or who belongs to the tenant, and the other type of account you have is a guest account. Now, the different types of guest accounts, you have your totally third-party accounts, which are your Gmail accounts, things like that. You have your B2B accounts, which is from another or Azure Active Directory, and you have your work or school accounts. Yep. So you have different types of guest accounts that you can invite. Oh, sorry, B2C accounts. So there are different types of guest accounts you can have, but just really one type of member account that you can use. Yeah. So in your automation, you would usually use if you're talking about user accounts, you would use this for any testing of your PowerShell scripts, right? And the way you create one of these user accounts would be in Azure Active Directory. We'll talk about creation shortly. Now, if we talk about service principles, you have multiple types of service principles. Now, this is used for automation itself, and the different type of service principles that you can have is one is an SPN. Whoop, should have put green. So you would have a type which is service principal. You would have a type which is application. And you would have a type which is native. And a managed identity. Yep. So there are different types of service principles. So if you're working with an application, let's say you're creating some kind of script, right? Some kind of automation. You would start by registering an application, which is here. Now you would register the application. That application would have, of course, it's a service principal type application, and that application would then get access to resources. Yep. So if you're using your user account, it would be a member account, and that member account would get permissions. Now let's talk about authentication, and we'll talk about authorization. Let's delete this. So when we talk about authentication and authorization, authentication is proving who you are. I am who I am. When you authenticate with a user account, you would have a username and you would have a password. Yep.
Correct.
You have a username and password, and that is what you can use to authenticate. Usually, when you're creating a script, you would do dollar credentials equals get hyphen credential, and you pass that credential to connect hyphen Azure AD user, or sorry, connect hyphen Azure AD, and then you pass those credentials. Or you do connect hyphen MG graph, you can pass those credentials to those different services. Now, when you
Mm-hmm.
use a certificate, the way you authenticate is either with, sorry, when you use an SPN, the way you authenticate is either via a certificate or via a key. So the way you connect to your interface or to Azure Active Directory will be different based on which type of account you use. Now, if I should have moved this a little further, move this here, then move this here. Now, once you connect, yep, once you connect, you're authenticating against Azure Active Directory. So let's yellow. So this is, I'll just put it as a diamond, sorry, as a triangle because it's hard to do that diamond thing. And here, now this is your resource, right? So this is, let's say your resource, and this is a resource. Let's use this, just this as your resource for now. Using your username and password, you prove who you are and you are able to access this particular resource. After accessing this resource, you can then run commands against it and get things. Similarly, with your SPN, you would first require access to this resource. Once you get access, once the admin gives you access to the resource, admin consent is granted, then you would be able to access these resources. Yep. So
Okay.
this is just the first part where you can create the user account. I'm not sure if all of you all know how to create user accounts, but the easiest way to create a user account is if you go to Azure Active Directory and when this loads, this is my test Azure Active Directory. Now, if you would have moved your subscription from one tenant to another, you could log into the Rapid Circle tenant and then just go ahead and switch directories to your test tenant. Yep.
Yeah.
And it might take some time to load. But yeah, you click over here and then you can switch directories to your, yeah, there it is. Switch directories and you can switch directories to your other tenants that you have. Yeah. Currently, I'm in the test tenant that I'd got long, long time ago. All right. So now
Mm-hmm.
that I'm in this test Active Directory, it's mine. So I can create users, create groups, all types of things over here. If this was Rapid Circle, it does not belong to me, right? Someone else owns Rapid Circle. So the Rapid Circle tenant. So I'm not able to do this. So over here, you go to users. So once you're in users, then you can, when this loads, you'll be able to create a member user and you can create a guest user. Let's have a look real quick. So you click on new user. These are all the test users that I have already created. But you create new user, you go over here and create new user. So you get an option over here. Either you create a user who's a member or a user who's a guest, right? So for this activity, I don't think it's that important to create users, but you can create users from the portal by entering the username, stuff like that, right? First name, last name. You can add the user to groups. You can give the user a role. This user has a user role, which is the permission the user has. If you want to give the user a different type of directory role, like your user admin, your global admin, or some type of admin account, then you would have to assign the role over here. Keep in mind, if you're running any PowerShell script, if you want to execute any commands that do things like set, remove, add, so any actions that need to be performed, which are anything apart from get, you would need some kind of role over here. All right. So first thing is you create the user, then you need to assign a role so that the user has permissions to do things. All right. So once the user is created, and then you would have to, so first thing is the user is created right here, some type of admin account or maybe a user admin. It's a member. Use your username and password to connect. to Azure Active Directory.
Mm-hmm.
Once you're connected to Azure Active Directory, then you have your Azure Active Directory, which is a resource, and you'll be able to pull information. I'll show you the connection bit shortly. Now, if you want to create an SPN, I have a good video that's already created on what an SPN is and what you can do with an SPN, how to create an SPN, how to create the certificate, how to use that certificate to authenticate as well. Because if you were to go through all that stuff again, it would be quite a lot of stuff. But if you look at here, just a simple way of creating an SPN is basically an app registration. Right. So when I go to my Azure Active Directory, you will see app registration over here. Click on app registration and you would need to register this application. And you will go to new registration and register this application for whatever purpose. Usually you would name it something along the lines of your solution. But I'll share the link to the video with you yeah, by the end of this training. And then you can go through that video if you would like to create SPNs. For now, we just focus on these two things. So I've showed you how to create usernames or users. I've showed you how to create your guest users. You can go through the video to create an SPN. Now, this is how you would connect, right? Currently, I'm connecting using a service principal. All right, so I can connect to Azure Active Directory, connect to AZ account, connect to MG Graph, or whatever kind of module you want to use. You can use that to connect. Once you're connected, then you can authenticate against the tenant. Now,
Mm-hmm.
over here, I've only granted my application rights to a few things, right? Let me see if what I have. I've only granted the application read permissions. So since I've granted this application just read, I will only be able to read the Active Directory. I will not be able to do anything else. So if I'm connecting using a service principal, I would use these commands, and this is using a certificate, right? So you would connect -Azure AD, you would specify your tenant, specify your certificate thumbprint, and whatever the client ID or the application ID is. And that's how you authenticate against the tenant using a SPN. If you're authenticating against a tenant using a username and password, then you would connect using this connect and hyphen credential would be get credentials, right? So if you have saved your credential, then it would, you could pass that credential. If you've not saved your credential, then you would just run this. You would be prompted for username and password. Let's say you have MFA enabled multi-factor authentication. You would need to sign in using this type of method where you don't specify your credentials in some kind of a variable, and then you pass it. So you would then enter your username, password, and you can do that. Now, keep in mind, this is using a user, right? Since this is using a user, I am forced to specify a username and password. But
Okay.
if this were using an SPN, an SPN is automated, right? So you
Mm-hmm.
can specify a certificate or a key. So if you're connecting using an SPN, you would not connect using that form, which is that which asks you for your credentials. You would need to specify it over here. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in this session, you have learned just a few things. You've learned what SPNs are. You've learned what SPNs are. You've learned what user accounts are. Yep. Now, this is just the basics where you have here your users, you have your types of users, you have the type of authentication, and the resource you have access to. All right.
Yeah.
Now, let me just delete that. That's a resource you have access to. So if I were to do the same thing here, I'll talk to you right now. Is a brief thing, description about the difference, how each one relates to each other. Yep. So when you create a user account, this is you, and this is your application. All right. So let's say this is Charlie. Disgusting handwriting. This is Charlie, and this is let's say Obi. Good automation name. Oh, so this is Charlie. This is Obi, right? Now, they you live in your house, and Obi lives on a computer somewhere, on a server somewhere. Now we have to register this application and create this user. So if I go to Azure Active Directory, which is here, let's just put a triangle. I go ahead and create a user account. And over here, I will come here and have an app registration. App registration. All right. So I register an application. Since I do have an identity now, an object in this tenant, I am able to authenticate against this tenant. Since this application is registered in this tenant, I'm able to authenticate using this application in this tenant. If you look at, if you go back to Azure Active Directory, we'll go to Home, and we'll go with Azure Active Directory. If I go to Azure Active Directory, I go to Enterprise Applications, right? Now, whenever you sign in or sign up for a tenant, you can come to this tab, which is Enterprise Applications, and you will notice a lot of enterprise applications that are already there. Let's say Microsoft Graph for PowerShell, O365. Well, this is one that I had created. And let's see, there's a login app, and let's do Exchange. Let me see if there's an Exchange one, or I think there's an Office. Three six Office Graph is here, Exchange, right? So you see these ones, they are Exchange Online. Now this is what Microsoft has created, right? You get Exchange Online as a part of M3, the M365 and your E5 license, yeah. So this
Mm.
is an application that is registered. So this is a Microsoft application which is in a different tenant, the different location. That application, let's say OB that you created on your computer, when you register that application in your tenant,
Mhm.
it becomes a local representation of this application, right? So when I register OB, or let's say Exchange, since we are talking about Exchange, let's do Exchange. So when Exchange is registered in your tenant, it has some of the features of Exchange, and it's registered from one tenant or from wherever it's located in a different tenant into this tenant. So this becomes an enterprise application. Yep. So a lot of people have confusion between enterprise applications and service principals. A service principal is a local representation of your application. So this application living on a server somewhere, if it needs to be registered, needs some kind of identity in this tenant, right? Just like you, or in this case, Charlie, if Abhishek wants to access the resources in this tenant, you need to register this user over here. So thus you have UPN, user principal name, and you have SPN, service principal name. Yep. So a service principal is a local representation of this application, and a user principal name is a local representation of yourself, you, a human being. With a service principal, I cannot log into a graphical interface. I cannot view the portal, but I can do everything I want in the backend. With Charlie or the Abhishek account, I can log into the portal and I can browse. Now, once you given this username and password and the service principal is created, in the beginning, you don't have access to anything. You just have access to login, right? So when this user account just can log in, that's it. Unless granted some kind of role, you will not be able to do anything. In this case, we had a user role already defined, and user role has some permissions, but not much. You have rights to view yourself, things like that. Right? Over here, let's assume that a username and a user and a service principal are the same. You don't have access to anything. So when this service principal logs in, all you can do is authenticate against this Azure Active Directory. You cannot do anything. Now, let's say I want this user or I want this SPN to do things, right? Now, to do things, you need to have access to something. First thing we talked about was authentication, right? Next bit is authorization. First bit, authentication, is I am who I am. You prove that using your username and password or certificate. Now, or MFA, things like that, the different forms. But what you have access to is authorization. So now the administrator will give you access to a few things, right? Let's say the administrator gives you access to read users, read groups, and maybe read mail. So you'll be able to do these things. So this particular user, this UPN, will be able to go ahead and read all these things. However, for this SPN as well, you get access to, let's say, users, groups, and mails. This SPN will be able to read all this stuff. Now, there are different types of permissions that you can set. One is read, one is read write, and one is read write all, I believe. But there are different types of permissions you can set. Just to show you what some of these permissions are, what permissions you can set, we'll go to our app registration again, and let's see if I have any owned applications. Let's just go to this test application, and you will see under API permissions, these are the when it loads, you would find out what are permissions you can give and why having SPN or creating SPNs are so damn cool. Because I can give access for this SPN to access, yeah, I can give access to this SPN so that it can, as an application, do a lot of things, right? And these are a few things that it can do, not few, a lot of things. If you wanted to just do access reviews, you can grant it just these rights, right? And you can drill down further. Maybe I just want this SPN to read access reviews, nothing else. So that's all the SPN can do. If we were talking about users or mail. So if I want the SPN just to access mail, I can have it like this. I can give the SPN access just to read mail. I can give access to this SPN just to send emails, things like that. So you can drill down to very specific areas of the permissions, and you can grant these permissions. This makes it easier for an administrator to authorize or to grant access or even manage access that SPNs have. Once you give an SPN permissions as an application, not the delegate permissions, but if you give it access as give it permissions as an application, you would need to grant admin consent. That means the administrator has given access to this SPN. The two different types of permissions you see over here, one is application and one is delegated. Delegated permissions is you act on behalf of yourself. So this application will act on behalf of the signed in user. If the signed in user, so if the signed in user is just a user admin, that means the application will only have user admin type of rights. However, if I want it in such a way that the user does not have any rights. However, the application should be able to do other things that the user cannot do. For example, the user is just a user, but I want the application to do things like a user admin or do things like even an exchange admin. Then I would grant that application permissions, where the application gets the permissions and can run services in the background. If you're using a user principal, then not advisable. But if you're using a user principal, keep it to just querying things, maybe getting information or just fast commands to check stuff. Or when you're troubleshooting, people who are in the support field, in let's say in the Microsoft support field, they usually sign in using this. And do troubleshooting, UPNs are perfect. But if you're doing anything other than just troubleshooting and getting small bits of information or setting some small bits of information, you should, or it would behoove you to probably have an principle that runs automation. Yep. So hopefully you'll have a good understanding or even a decent understanding of what UPNs and SPNs are and what you choose to use in your solution going forward or in the future. Yep. All right. So thank you for the time and cheers. You have a good day.